Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Community Law and Mediation Centre for Environmental Justice webinar on centering housing in climate action. Today, we're focused on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. This directive is to ensure that the built environment sector is reducing emissions in line with the EU's Green Deal, and the EU's revised Energy Performance of Buildings Directive aims to achieve climate neutrality within the built environment sector by 2050. So the revised directive requires member states, including Ireland, to increase retrofitting and to regulate the embodied carbon of buildings for the first time. It also stipulates that measures must focus on supporting vulnerable households and encourages the adoption of safeguards for tenants such as rent supports and caps. So the transposition of this directive really provides a unique opportunity to ensure adequate and affordable homes for all. We are so delighted today to be joined by an expert panel of speakers. And so I'm going to pass over to them now. And just to flag that really the purpose of today's session is to prepare everyone in the audience for the consultation on the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive. It's not opened yet. We don't have a timeline for this, but Ireland is due to submit a plan to the European Commission by the end of December in this year. So we expect to see it over the coming months. And so this webinar is just to prepare for that. So I'm now going to hand over to our first speaker, Ciarán Cuffe, who we're delighted to be joined by today. Ciarán Cuffe, as you'll know, served as member of the European Parliament from Ireland for the Dublin constituency from July 2019 to July 2024. And Ciarán also acted as rapporteur for the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So he's going to speak to us about that experience. And thanks very much, Ciarán.
Not at all. And thanks for the invitation to join you. I hope the audio quality is good. I had hoped to be in an office for this, but I'm actually on a bus in the middle of Belgium on the way back from a visit to an electric car plant in Belgium. So I've focused on climate issues this morning. But what I want to do over the next 5 or 10 minutes is just give you a quick overview of the challenges, the wins with this Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. It's got to be remembered that the EPBD, as we called it, was part of a whole series of pieces of legislation that were passed over the last 6 years by the European institutions here in Brussels. The way the process works is that the European Commission publishes a draft law, and then it's amended by both the Council of Ministers from the 27 countries around Europe and by the European Parliament of 700 members. And I had the privilege of being the Parliament rapporteur or lead negotiator on this directive. In a nutshell, the directive is trying to cut down the amount of energy and the greenhouse gas emissions that come from buildings. We're not going to tackle climate change with one law. In fact, about 20 different laws were passed in that last period of 5 years in the European Parliament. It was known as the Fit for 55 package because it is working to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in Europe by 55% between 1990 and the year 2030. And so far, it is more or less on track to do that. Science would argue that we should go further, but in terms of political compromises, it is working well so far. But the swing to the right of European politics over the last couple of years does cause some threats to what may happen in the coming years. So we're tackling buildings and we're trying to reduce the energy use and, of course, the greenhouse gas emissions coming from those buildings. Why buildings, you might ask? Well, buildings consume 36% of the energy in Europe, or 40% of the energy actually, and are responsible for 36% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So they're a big part of the climate problem. And if we solve the issue in buildings, we're well on our way to our climate goals. It wasn't easy to get this across the line. There was, and there still is, a fair amount of climate skepticism, not just within the European Parliament, but obviously across the pond in the US at the moment. There's headwinds that are very strong. We saw wind projects being dropped by an executive order of the US president over the last week. So climate skepticism was part of the challenge, but there was also Euroscepticism. There's an increasing amount of elected representatives in Europe who are skeptical of the European project and who really feel that Brussels should not be interfering in the lives of the citizens of Europe. Obviously led by Viktor Orban, but Fico, Meloni, there's many leaders around Europe who say, look, Brussels should not be dealing with these issues. It's up to countries to decide. And of course, in the middle of the last 5 years, we had the pandemic, we had supply chain issues, and we had rising costs with inflation. So the challenges were very real. Challenges of climate, Euroscepticism, costs, and supply chains. Nonetheless, we got quite a few wins in this law. The big picture, it's trying to get buildings down to zero emissions by the year 2050, and it has set goals for what we want to achieve by 2030 and 2033. In very simple terms, a 16% in energy reduction by 2030 and a 20 or 26%, depending on whether you're talking residential or commercial buildings, by the year 2033. So actually, these goals are very high. But it's not just about those headline figures. If you drill down into the directive, you'll see each article is trying to address a different aspect of the problem of buildings. So Article 1 says, look, we're tackling energy, we're tackling carbon dioxide emission. Article 3 talks about national building renovation plans. And as I think you said in your intro, by the end of this year, every country in Europe, every member state has to produce a draft national building renovation plan showing how it's going to tackle the unique type of buildings in that country, deal with the climate in that country, and maximize the use of renewables, which could be geothermal in Hungary, it could be wind in Ireland, it could be solar down in Spain, and it could be hydro up in Sweden. So those plans, the first draft is due at the end of this year. Article 5 talks about minimum energy performance standards. And when I talked about targets for 2030 and 2033, the MABS, as we call them, a bit confusing because they can be confused with MEPs, but they're not. But the MABS sets the targets that need to be achieved in the coming years. Article 7 says that by the year 2030, whenever we plan a new building, we'll have to estimate its global warming potential. So that's the embodied carbon. A bit like the embodied carbon in a car, there's embodied carbon in anything that you buy or use, and we want to start measuring it for buildings. So that's a big win. The targets I mentioned earlier, so we do have in place targets for 2030 and 2033, and in the coming years, we'll have to set targets for the years all the way up to 2050. Article 10 talks about rooftop solar. We've seen an explosion in photovoltaic panels around Europe in the last few years. We've written that into the law. So any large new public buildings, by the end of next year, will have to have rooftop solar, unless it's completely unfeasible. And then gradually we go from large buildings down to small buildings, from public to the private sector, so that by 2030, every new building in Europe will have to have solar PV. So that's a big win in the directive. We talk about a new standard for new buildings that kicks in the coming years, and we call it a zero emission standard. We're familiar with this clunky phrase, NZEB, which is near zero emission buildings. ZEB is the next phase of this, and it requires about a 20% improvement in energy performance over the buildings that we're building now. So the zero emission building standard is a good step forward. We also talk about building renovation passports. So when you do a renovation or when you build a new building, it'll come with a passport. Electronic, of course, but it shows how you can improve the energy performance of that building in the coming years. And I know when you get a building energy rating in Ireland, it does tell you what you should do next. This will be spelt out in more detail for every building in Europe what's the next step in improving your building. So the passports are a big step forward. We had hoped to get a phase out of the use of fossil fuels in buildings by the year 2035. We pushed that out to 2040, which I'm a bit disappointed in, but at least it's there, with a bit of fancy language around it. But look, the end is nigh for using fossil fuels to heat and cool our buildings. And you can see that most new homes in Ireland are using heat pumps, and they are much more efficient than using fossil fuels, even if some of the electricity is coming from gas in Ireland. We also talk about sustainable mobility. Why sustainable mobility in buildings? Well, because we need to charge our vehicles. So whether that's an e-scooter or an e-car, we want to ensure that when we do a big renovation on an apartment block or a set of buildings, that there's plugs in it, as simple as that. And I'm really pleased that we got quite a strong commitment, not just to putting in the plugs, but putting in the cables, putting in the ducts, so that we're future-proofing our building stock. And me being me, I also made sure that we have storage for bikes and cargo bikes when we do these big renovations, because it's not just about converting 1 million petrol cars to 1 million electric cars. We need to get people walking, cycling, and using public transport as well. Article 17 talks about the finance. There's a danger, and we've seen this in Germany. They use the phrase renoviction, where you upgrade the building, raise the rents, and kick out the existing tenants. So we have safeguards in the law about ensuring that vulnerable tenants' needs are addressed, and also about funding that is needed for these renovations, using European funds where possible from the Social Climate Fund, from structural funds, and from other types of funding that will be available in the coming years. The last couple of issues I want to mention, we talk about one-stop shops, and that's literally somewhere where you can walk in the door and they will tell you what you should do with your building. We have one, a very high-profile one, in the middle of Cork City, funded by the council and the Sustainable Energy Agency of Ireland, Authority of Ireland, but we need to have more of these pretty much in every region, if not every county around Ireland. Impartial advice, because we're bombarded with radio ads and TV ads. You need to buy this product. We need good impartial advice. So that'll happen all around Europe. There's stuff in there about smart buildings, about regular inspection of the building systems like air conditioning, boilers, and so on, particularly for larger buildings. I won't bore you with the detail of that. One last thing is we want to renovate the worst first. Why? Because people living in poverty are generally living in poor quality buildings, and we want to ensure that we tackle the worst performing buildings first. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what the recast Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is all about. It's a bit confusing because this is the 4th iteration of this directive. We started off back in 2002, and with each iteration, we're really going further. But if we do tackle buildings, we're going to achieve a lot. And I'm very proud of the work that we did across political divides, working with parties from the left to protect tenants, working from parties of the right to create jobs, working with unions, working with all stakeholders in this space. And I think we will see a lot more renovations in the coming years all around Europe.
Thank you so much, Ciarán. That was an absolutely brilliant overview of the new directive and such a brilliant whistle-stop tour. So thank you so much for that. I should mention to everyone in the audience, if you have questions, please do put them into the chat box and we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. I'm now delighted to hand over to Marion Jammet of the Irish Green Building Council. Marion is the Director of Policy and Advocacy, and she's going to speak to the carbon impact of the built environment sector and key challenges and opportunities with this revised directive. So thanks very much, Marion, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm just going to try to share my screen now on everyone. Hopefully that's going to work. So I'm just going to go full screen. Perfect. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Delighted to be with you today to give you an overview of the carbon impact of the built environment in Ireland and the opportunities associated with the transposition of the EPPD into Irish law. What I'm hoping to do today is really like to go a bit more in depth in terms of some of the articles that Ciarán already covered, and to finish with a call to action for all of us on this webinar today, to know more like about what we can actually do to support with the transposition process. But first, did you know that the built environment in Ireland is currently responsible for 37% of our national emission? So that's the same as agriculture. So about 23% of these emissions are associated with operational carbon emission. So that's the emission associated with the energy we use to heat, light, cool our buildings. And then about 14% of these emissions relate to embodied carbon emission. So as it was mentioned by Ciarán, that's really the emissions that are associated with the extraction of raw materials, the production of construction products, the construction of buildings, and so on. And when we did do that study a few years ago to look at the full life cycle impact of buildings on our national emission, we also tried to do some modeling and carbon projection. Obviously, this is always challenging, but we did commission that piece of study from a group of researchers from UCD. And what it does show on that graph is that in a business as usual scenario, like if we deliver on all our target in relation to energy renovation and operational carbon, yes, or operational emission in the built environment will decline till 2030. You can see that in green here. But this will be almost like fully like compensated, I suppose, by an increase in the embodied carbon emission. And that's because to date, these emissions are not regulated in Ireland, and also because we are building so much. So really, like what I'm trying to say, that it's critical and it's fantastic that the EPPD, for the first time, not only look at operational carbon emission, but also at the embodied carbon emission. So what I would like to do now is to look at some of the articles that we see as key in relation to operational carbon, and then to look more specifically at what is in the directive in relation to embodied carbon. I'll be quite short on operational carbon because I think other people today are going to cover that more. But if we focus primarily on energy renovation, because that's one really of the biggest challenge. In the directive, you have provision that relate to the macro level and then to the building level. So at the macro level, all the member states have to produce what is called a National Building Renovation Plan. So this is going to replace what was called previously the long-term renovation strategy, but it's actually far more detailed than what we had in the previous version of the directive. In the sense, I suppose the idea there is really like to have a roadmap, a clear strategy, a clear plan to fully decarbonize our built environment by 2050 in line with the European targets. And really like to make sure that we have a clear set plan of action to achieve that, being like detailed target to 2030, 2040, 2050, having clear policies, measure, having clear information on the level of investment needed, and so on. So really they are actionable plans. What is important there is that all the member states need to submit a first draft of the National Building Renovation Plan to the European Commission by the end of December. So we can expect a public consultation this autumn from the Department of Climate Action on this plan. So I would really like encourage you to have a look, I suppose, and to contribute to this consultation. The IGBC did a workshop on this topic in July, and we will publish the findings of this workshop in the next 2 weeks. At the building level, there are a number of articles when it comes to energy renovation, which are interesting. As Ciarán did mention, at least for the non-residential sector, we see the introduction of minimum energy performance standards, so MABS, which are really there to target the worst performing buildings in priority. So really like the idea with a MABS is to require like existing buildings to meet like an energy performance requirement by a specific date. So again, we did a workshop on this topic last year in September to discuss it with our public sector, with the industry, and you can find the findings of the workshop on our website. Hopefully the slide will be circulated afterwards. But really like what is in the text is that we need first to identify the 16 and 26% lowest performing buildings. So that's a first step. That's going to be based on data from 2020. So most likely being based on BER. And then by 2030, all buildings in this 16% batch must be improved. So that's the 16%. And then by 2033, all buildings in the 26% batch must be improved. Now, at the moment, again, it hasn't been published. We are not clear exactly what is going to happen. We suspect it's going to be based on the BER, which makes sense at the beginning because that's the only data that we would have probably for 2020. But one thing that we do think is important as the IGBC is also to look more and more at actual performance of buildings, because ultimately what we want is to decarbonize our built environment. And the BER is an asset rating. It's not based on performance. So that's clearly something we would like to look at in future. Other interesting things at the building level when it comes to energy renovation, it's not only about regulation and, telling, okay, you need to renovate this building by a certain date. You obviously need to include some support as well. And there are a number of articles in the directive that provide that level of support. As Ciarán says, there's a number of articles that relate to financial incentives, making sure that grants potentially can be simplified or targeted as well, like in terms of targeting specifically vulnerable households, people in energy poverty, looking at aggregation, but also looking at alternative sources of funding, such as low interest rate and mortgages. So all this discussion around one-stop shop. Now, this terminology is a bit confusing in an Irish context because we have a specific definition of one-stop shop. But what really it means in the directive, as it was said, is that it's an information hub, so a physical place where you can go to get impartial advice on energy renovation. So, and again, there is a strong focus in that text in relation to vulnerable households, low-income households, or people in energy poverty. The last interesting part is the renovation passport. So the passport needs to be introduced by all member states, at least on a voluntary basis, by May 2026. And really, the idea there is to outline, or in a few steps, an existing buildings can be renovated to achieve the ZEB standard over time. Just would like to mention on that the IGBC, with support from SEAI, is currently working on a pilot to develop renovation passport for non-residential buildings. So please get in touch if you want more information. We did a very comprehensive study as well on this topic on residential buildings a few years ago, looking at it from the perspective of the building industry and from the perspective of the homeowners. So you can find more information on this research on our website. Moving on to embodied carbon, which is really like the new thing that we can see in the directive. So Article 7, for the first time, look at really the life cycle impact of buildings. And that's very interesting because for the first time, it focused first on measuring and then reducing the life cycle global warming potential of buildings. And if you think this is 14% of our national emission, this is absolutely critical. But one thing we tend to forget, and that's why it's important, I think, to start measuring, is that the embodied carbon of a building really relates to both the quantity of material that we use and the carbon intensity of the material that we use. So it's not only about using lower embodied carbon type of material, it's also about the way we design our buildings. And that's that's something we can see there, really like the article by measuring and reducing and to encourage both better design and better choices of materials. In terms of the timeline on embodied carbon, so what we have in the text of the directive is member states must submit a roadmap in terms of the target and the limit values that they plan to introduce from 2030 by 2027. We all need to start measuring embodied carbon for all new buildings from 2028, new buildings, and then for all new buildings from 2030. So you can clearly see this on the timeline. But we are not starting from scratch there. A lot of work has already been done on this topic. In particular, IGBC, in partnership with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland and a number of partners, have worked very hard on the development of the methodology, on developing benchmark. SEAI ran a public consultation in spring in relation to the national methodology, so we are already quite advanced on this topic. For people from the construction industry on this call, we also have a lot of material on our website in terms of training, upskilling, in terms of methodology and embodied carbon in general. The other thing as well is that we shouldn't forget this is a directive, so we can also be more ambitious than the text of the directive. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is because, as I say, we are building a lot. Embodied carbon emission are 14% of our national emission, and there are a number of member states that have already regulated embodied carbon. For instance, Denmark, France, and to some extent Sweden and the Netherlands. We have done a lot of work in this topic in Ireland, so obviously it will take time to set it up, but one thing we should consider, we think, as IGBC, is that instead of simply measuring by 2028 for larger building as a requirement of the directive, we should really consider starting to introduce target from 2028. Now, this target may not be super ambitious, but at least it sets the right mindset and focus in terms of the way we work in the industry. So that's kind of a very brief overview, I suppose, of things that we see as critical in the directive, and there are many more, as it was already highlighted. But if there are a few things that I would like you to take from my presentation today is first, I suppose, that the transposition of the EPPD, which must be fully transposed by May 2026, is really a fantastic opportunity to integrate like strategic action into our national policy in terms of better technical and financial support, in terms of having better data on our building stock, in terms of tackling embodied carbon, and really how we implement the directive will really impact the affordability, resilience, and ultimately the climate impact of our sector for the next decade. So really, I think we shouldn't miss this opportunity, and I would encourage anyone on the call today to be like very engaged with the public consultations that are coming. And for people in the industry, you can also start like upskilling with some of the courses. Some of them are free of charge on the IGBC website. And also please get involved in our pilot in relation to renovation passport and also in renovation to in relation to and addressing embodied carbon impact. That's it for me, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Marion, for providing such granular detail there. If possible, to share some of the resources that you referred to in your slides, maybe in the chat box while people are here and can access them, that would be super. I'm now delighted to hand over to Clare O'Connor, Programme Coordinator with Friends of the Earth Ireland, who is going to speak to energy poverty, housing and advocacy, and community retrofit needs and opportunities within the recast directive. Thanks very much for joining us, Clare.
Thanks so much, Clodagh, and thanks to everyone in CLM for organising the webinar today. It's been really great so far. And really interesting to hear our previous speakers as well. It's always great to hear Ciarán speak, having been involved in the directive. He really knows it inside out, and he did brilliant work on that. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. How's that? Can you see that, Clodagh?
Yeah, and that's there, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Clare.
Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about energy poverty and retrofitting needs and opportunities that exist within the EPBD. So I'll give an overview of why Friends of the Earth look at this topic specifically. I'll also talk a little bit about the context of energy poverty in Ireland, and then I'll put forward Friends of the Earth's proposals and solutions as to how transposition of the EPBD can be used to tackle energy poverty for good. So I'm program coordinator with Friends of the Earth. We run a campaign called Warm Homes for All, which is ultimately ending energy poverty and making sure that people are at the centre of the energy transition as well, and making sure that no one really is left out of this heat and retrofitting transition that we're really lucky to see accelerating at the moment in Ireland. And why is this important to Friends of the Earth? So the reason we work on this is that people who are already marginalised are often those living in the worst housing conditions. They're locked into fossil fuels, they're locked into volatile energy prices, and they're blocked from accessing the renewable energy solutions and being involved in the energy transition. So it's really the principles of climate justice that the people who have done least to contribute to climate change and the people who can't afford to be involved in climate action have to be prioritised and make sure that they're not left behind. And one way we kind of see this materialise is through fuel poverty, and the three main causes of fuel poverty are inefficient homes, low incomes and high energy costs. And today, obviously, because we're talking about the Buildings Directive, I'll primarily focus on inefficient homes. But it's really important that this exists in the context of low incomes and higher energy costs as well, that if we are actually to effectively tackle fuel poverty and lift people out of fuel poverty, we have to tackle low incomes and high energy costs as well. But my focus today will be on buildings primarily. So just the context of energy costs, I guess, I'm sure we've all felt it over the last couple of years. Costs of energy rose between 2019 and 23 by 58%. In 2023, 10% of people in Ireland went without heat because of cost. And what we find is that it's people who are marginalised or struggling in other ways already are the ones who have had to go without heat when we see these crises unfold. So one-parent families, a quarter of people with disabilities went without heat, and a quarter of people who are long-term unemployed also went without heat because they couldn't afford it in 2023. So it's really stark, and it's important that when we're having this discussion around energy costs, around energy efficiency, that these are the people who are centred and prioritised in our discussions. Some research done by the Measles Centre last year showed that the cost of meeting your minimum energy needs can be up to 55% higher in a low efficiency dwelling compared to a high efficiency, or compared to a mid-range energy dwelling. So people who are in the least efficient homes have the highest energy costs. And then just looking at buildings as well, it's an estimation that about 80% of Irish homes have a BER of a C or lower, but only 42% of homes have BER certs. That is an estimate. And then residential energy use in Ireland is about 25% of our total energy consumption and is responsible for about 15% of our overall energy emissions. And interestingly, as of 2022, 46% of Irish households were still dependent on the most polluting fuels, so oil, peat and coal. So it's really important that when we're having these discussions as well, that we're looking at who is burning the most fossil fuels as well. And ultimately it is these households who are on oil, peat and coal. And then an interesting thing that we look at in Friends of the Earth is who is living in the least efficient homes. And what we've found is that it tends to be people who are non-home owners, particularly people who are renting on the housing assistance payment, and people in local authority dwellings as well. So you can see here that HAP tenants really have the poorest quality housing out of those three. It's really important that, when we're talking about the worst performing buildings and tackling those, that these are the people who are in the worst performing homes. So they absolutely have to be targeted in any national building renovation plan. And then I know I'm mainly talking about energy poverty here, but just to flag that we really are paddy last in Europe when it comes to renewable heating. We have the lowest levels of renewable heating of any EU country. So we're really, really lagging behind when it comes to decarbonisation of heat. And I'll discuss that a little bit a little bit later, but we've a long way to go when it comes to decarbonisation of heat, but that can be addressed in our national building renovation plans and in the transposition of this directive. So back at the end of March, we held a forum, Build Better Lives, where we brought together stakeholders to discuss the transposing the energy performance of buildings directive. We brought tenants unions, we brought members of the Roma community, we brought the National Women's Council, as well as policy experts all together just to discuss how we can transpose the EPBD in a socially just way. And we got to hear from some people's real lived experiences, particularly people in social housing complexes who really feel like they've been left behind in these retrofitting schemes. What seems to be happening is that some councils are prioritising maybe more easier to retrofit homes and aren't actually getting the worst quality, worst performing homes. And we had a tenant share that he was really struggling. He had really bad respiratory illnesses, and his doctor had actually written a letter to the council requesting that their home be prioritised for retrofitting, but they really hadn't got anywhere with it, despite all the tenants coming together, setting up meetings with the council and not getting anywhere. So they were really disheartened as well. So I think it's really just important that when we're having these discussions, these are the people that we're really bringing to the fore, people who feel really disillusioned and not part of this transition at all. We also did, there's a little QR code, you can see a little report on the event there on that QR code, but we also brought some members of the Roma community who again, are really struggling with energy costs, don't have the agency, you know, to insulate their homes or to change their heating systems. And there was a real sense of many of them just being grateful to kind of have a roof over their heads while really struggling with energy costs and having to turn off their heat and really living in cold and mouldy homes. So yeah, you can read a little bit more about that there, and we will have a report on that event coming out in the next couple of weeks as well. So EPBD and energy poverty, and I'll specifically look at the national building renovation plans because that is what's happening over the next couple of months, hopefully. Article 15 states that member states must assess and address the issue of energy poverty when drafting their plans, and they must include measures to alleviate energy poverty, particularly targeting the worst performing buildings where low income or vulnerable households live. And Ciarán said that earlier, you know, we know that people in we know the worst performing buildings house people on the lowest incomes and in the most difficult circumstances who don't have that agency or the cash available to invest in retrofitting. So I'll just go through Friends of the Earth priority recommendations for the national building renovation plans and how they can tackle energy poverty, but also get us off fossil fuel heating as well. So we need to make sure the voices of people who are most impacted by energy poverty are included in building renovation plan development. So it's September now. The first draft has to be in by the end of this year. If an effective public consultation is to happen that does include those voices, that has to start right now. You know, we can't really delay it any longer if it's to be done well and to be done effectively. People who are most excluded are renters, social housing and HAP tenants, travellers, Roma communities, single parents and people in emergency accommodation. So a plan needs to be put in place right now as to how exactly are we going to engage these people and to make sure that they are consulted and their voices are heard when we're talking about retrofit plans. Priority recommendation 2. So I discussed a little bit earlier about housing tenures and the fact that non-owner occupied households tend to be more likely in energy poverty. So we've been calling for minimum BERs in the private rental sector, which has actually, it is a government commitment to implement minimum BERs in the rental sector from this year. We see that there's a real opportunity in implementing the minimum energy performance standards in the non-residential sector and, you know, expanding that and also including the residential sector. That can really start at a very low level, for example, an E, and be introduced on a phase basis. It's not that we're going to suddenly force every rental property to be an A or a B immediately. If that's introduced, it obviously has to coincide with really strong tenant protections and that proper resources are put into enforcement of that as well. Our third recommendation is making a commitment to renovating all public housing by 2030. At the moment, there's a commitment to renovating 25% of social housing by 2030. We think they need to start with the worst performing first. You know, we've heard from social housing tenants that are in really, really dire circumstances, and it's those houses that absolutely need to be prioritised, and they should be set out explicitly in the National Building Renovation Plan. There's a need for a multi-annual funding strategy. At the moment, social or local authorities just get a guarantee of 1 year's funding basically, and cannot plan in advance more than a year. Additionally, we've been calling for a community energy advice service in every county. This could align with the EPBD requirement to introduce impartial, independent one-stop shops. I know we do have one-stop shops in Ireland, but they're not impartial or independent. So a really good example of that is one that's actually in Cork City Council at the moment, and you can just walk in and get all the information you need on your grants, on your loans. But there really needs to be a holistic scope to these one-stop shops as well. You know, people in the rental sector can get information on their rights if their home is being retrofitted. The people can get help with energy bills, and a big one is that there's post-installation support with heat pumps as well. We found talking to people that a lot of people are having issues with the actual running of their heat pumps. And then the really important bit is that there is actually like community liaison and outreach as part of that multilingual outreach, and that there's literacy supports as well, because that can be a massive barrier for people in accessing retrofit grants, and applications can be really scary and overwhelming. And number 5 is we need to see some updates to the warmer home scheme. I said earlier, HAP tenants are often left out. The warmer home scheme should be expanded to include HAP tenants on the condition that they get a long-term lease. As well as that, between January and October 2024, 724 oil boilers and 894 gas boilers were installed under the warmer home scheme. This is locking low-income households into fossil fuels for years to come. And these are households who can't afford to put in their own new heating systems for the most part. It's really concerning that public money is going towards new oil and gas boilers. A ban on public subsidies for fossil fuel boilers actually came into force at the beginning of 2025 through the EPBD, which is really positive. However, we're still seeing in Ireland oil and gas boilers being installed into the homes of fuel-poor households, and that's really concerning, and from a climate justice perspective as well. And then number 6 is ramping up renewable heating rollout as well. We need to see a plan to phase out fossil fuel boilers and fossil fuel heatings in home. A national heat policy statement was due to be published in 2024. We still haven't seen it yet. There's an opportunity with the National Building Renovation Plan for that heat policy statement to be part of that, and to see a phase out plan for oil and gas boilers. And as I said earlier, it really needs to be targeting the solid fuel and oil burning households first, many of which are rural households. So there's a real opportunity there for a targeted rural retrofit scheme that really targets those most polluting fuels first, and making sure that renewable options are both the most affordable to buy upfront and to operate as well. So making sure that people who do get heat pumps aren't paying more than people who are on oil and gas. There's a recap of my recommendations. I've probably gone over time, just shout if I have. So there's kind of a recap. And yeah, as Marion said, like, there is an opportunity here to go beyond the minimum requirements that's needed in the EPBD. I know Ciarán, when he was negotiating the EPBD, had gone for more ambition, including the minimum energy performance standards in the residential sector. I think that's a massive opportunity. I think it will bring a lot of people along who currently can't access retrofitting or the energy transition. And a plan to phase out fossil fuel heating is a big one. And yeah, what will success look like? Warm, dry, healthy homes with less excess debts, better health, lower bills, making sure renters are included and protected. They're already at the mercy of the housing crisis. They really need to be prioritised as we address the climate crisis as well. Making sure everyone can access trusted and impartial advice to get going on their retrofit journey as well, decarbonising heat and energy, ending energy poverty for good, and green jobs with fair pay and training opportunities. I didn't get really to speak about that too much. It's in our EPBD blog post, which I'll share in this chat afterwards. So, thanks very much, everyone. You can find out more about Friends of the Earth and what we're up to on my little QR code there as well, or email me if you have any more questions on that. And thanks again to Clodagh and to all the other speakers. It's a really great webinar.
Thanks, Claire. That was excellent and as comprehensive as ever. If you want to share some of the resources mentioned in the chat, I think that could be really helpful for people. And we would fully endorse Claire's recommendation to convene a public consultation as soon as possible to make sure that everybody can have their say. I'm now delighted to hand over to Cristina Pricop, who's Senior Associate at CLASP. Cristina is going to speak today about indoor air quality and focusing on gas cooking in particular and policy opportunities connected to the recast directive in that regard. So thanks so much, Cristina, for joining us.
Hi, Clodagh. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, having slight technical difficulties. Sorry, just 1 second.
Take your time.
There we go. Yes. Thank you, everyone. Hello. Great to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much for the invitation. I will indeed be speaking about cooking as an important element that influences indoor air pollution and indoor air quality, and what we see to be a bit of a blind spot in the EPPD as it currently stands. But of course, no legislation can cover everything. But we also see an important opportunity now with the implementation. So very briefly before diving right in, for those who may not be familiar with us, CLASP, we are an international NGO, and we work to improve the energy and environmental performance of appliances, and our goal is to help accelerate the transition to a more sustainable world. So as part of that, we work on cooking appliances, gas and electric appliances, and when we're looking at the EPPD, we see a vision towards zero emission buildings, as has been mentioned before, and that includes zero on-site carbon emissions from fossil fuels, which of course isn't really happening if we have a gas flame in our kitchens. And the directive also has requirements for indoor environmental quality, and gas cooking in particular is known to be associated with health-harming air pollution, particularly NO2, nitrogen dioxide. So that's why we're talking about a missed opportunity for improved indoor air quality and health, for full household decarbonization, and for increased affordability, because when we have a household that has been fully electrified, we can take it off the gas grid and have the gas standing charge removed from the energy bills. So there is a silver lining, as has already been mentioned. This is a directive, so what it does is it sets a minimum and not a maximum, and there is more that can be done at the local and the national levels. So to take a step back, gas cooking, why am I talking about it? Why am I focusing on it? It's because this is a public health risk. There are decades and decades of research that link gas cooker pollution to respiratory, cardiovascular, mental, and other health risks. And there's this illustration to the right. I won't go into all the details, but what I really wanted to show is that air pollution from gas stoves impacts all different parts of the human body, and that there are specific vulnerable population groups, such as children, whose respiratory system is still developing. They have higher breathing rates, they are shorter, and so they are closer to the emission source. And so we see that children who live in a gas cooking home have 42% increased risk of current asthma. And there are other vulnerable population groups as well, such as people who spend more time indoors, who could be the elderly or could be people living with chronic illnesses. So in Ireland, there's around 30% of households that still use gas alone or gas in combination with electricity in their kitchens. And research shows that this is linked to an estimated 7,500 asthma cases per year that are due to cooking on gas. So when we CLASP started working on this, there was a lot of research out there, but where we thought we could contribute was in terms of specific and recent data from European households, because it is notoriously difficult to monitor air quality inside people's houses. So we ran a large data gathering project. We were in 7 European countries, over 250 households, and what we saw was that gas cooking households regularly exceed recommended levels of nitrogen dioxide. And we took as benchmark the World Health Organization guidelines. So these are very science-backed health guidelines. And then we also looked at the European Union air quality standards, because there's legislation that regulates outdoor air quality, but not for indoor air quality. And in contrast, electric cooking households, of course, typically had a lower NO2 pollution level. We also considered cooker hoods, because sometimes they are presented as a solution to the gas cooking problem. And unfortunately, what we saw is that the presence of a cooker hood does not significantly impact air quality. So we looked at different types of hoods, hoods that are ducted to the outside, recirculation hoods, the impact that it has on the air quality in different rooms of the house, and we did not see a major improvement. Now, ventilation is still very important, because when we cook, there is also particulate matter that is being emitted regardless of the technology that we use. So it's always important to ventilate. But this is very kind of individual behavior dependent. And there are a number of reasons why people ventilate and use their cooker hood. That's usually more linked to smoke and odor removal than to indoor air pollution. As you see on the right, there are reasons why people turn on their cooker. So if, say, you're boiling a couple of eggs, there's not a lot of odor coming out, you might not want to turn on the hood, because there's maybe too much noise, but you're still being exposed to the same level of pollution that comes from the cooking flame itself. So while this is an important solution at the individual level, it is not, from our perspective, an optimal policy solution. But with the EPPD, there is an opportunity to elevate this conversation about indoor environmental quality. It's a conversation that has been happening in health circles already. 2 decades ago, the WHO recognized the right to healthy indoor air, but this has not really penetrated the political agendas and the public discourse as much. But now the indoor environmental quality is covered in the EPPD, but something to really watch out for is the fact that the definition of this environmental quality is left to the member states. And there are a number of different ways in which this could be operationalized. For example, we could be looking at ventilation as the main determining factor, and we've just seen why we think that's not ideal. But there's an opportunity there to create this kind of connection between indoor air quality, NO2 pollution, and gas cookers. And we know we've run consumer surveys, and it's 61% of people who would consider getting rid of the gas cooker if they knew that there were health implications linked to the appliance. And there's also an opportunity in terms of decarbonization, because this full house decarbonization means tackling heating, cooling, and cooking. We cannot assume that cooking retrofit will automatically be happening. It is a smaller investment to get an induction cooktop, for example, than getting a heat pump, but it's still high enough of a cost upfront that it can be a barrier for certain households. And the EPPD sets out a number of tools and measures, and there's the deep renovations and national renovation plans, and all of these things can deliver bigger benefits if we include in those thinking about replacing gas cookers with electric ones. And this will also bring benefits in terms of equity and affordability. As I was saying, it can reduce energy bills by removing the gas standing charge once the household is fully electrified. And I wanted to also briefly mention the pilot project that we ran together with our partners at Global Action Plan. We were in 10 social housing homes in Greater Manchester. These are houses that had already been retrofitted with the heat pump, but they were reliant on gas for their cooking. So we went in, we switched out the gas cooktop to induction, and we have on that QR code, you can see the project website, and we have testimonials from people who spoke about the benefits of this change. And we also have some guidance for local authorities and some policy pathways that are specific to the UK. Some of them, but I think a lot of them are still very interesting to consider. And finally, policy recommendations. Indoor air quality and environmental quality metrics must include NO2 measures, because for better or for worse, what we don't measure doesn't exist. So The benefits of electric cooking will not be visible unless we also measure NO2 levels. And secondly, cooking must be included in tools like one-stop shops or national building renovation plans, as well as in financial instruments for renovation. And lastly, while the EPPD is a very important instrument, it is a big piece of legislation, we must consider a variety of policy pathways and measures, and those can include awareness-raising campaigns and labeling of appliances, as well as better energy efficiency testing. So really the message that I want to leave you with is that supporting cooking retrofits is a cost-effective way of unlocking health and planetary benefits while making the green transition more equitable and affordable for everyone. And I have some QR codes. I'll share the resources in the chat, Claudia. I know that's what you've been suggesting, so I will follow that suggestion. And with that, thank you very much. That has been my presentation. And if you have any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Cristina. That was really, really excellent. And I think you really drove home the point that indoor air pollution is a housing justice issue, and it disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, like those experiencing fuel and energy poverty that we've been discussing with previous speakers. So thank you so much for bringing that perspective. We're now delighted to hand over to Brian McIntyre, Programme Manager with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Brian is going to speak to us about progress towards Ireland's current national retrofit plan and what the transposition of the recast directive might look like in practice. So thanks a million for joining us, Brian. And thank you to everyone who's putting their questions into the Q&A box. We will have some time for those after Brian's presentation. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Winnie, Claude. I think everyone can hopefully see that there now, the presentation. Like I said, I'm going to talk about the National Retrofit Plan progress and some of the kind of on-the-ground challenges that we've faced. So I know today's backdrop is the EPBD, but just in the short term, we have our Climate Action Plan targets to achieve by 2030, and they're essentially, until recently we didn't realise, but they're a stepping stone towards where we need to be in 2050. So the Climate Action Plan set out to significantly reduce Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And to do that, we need to upgrade 500,000 homes to a B2 of a BR rating or a cost optimal equivalent, need to install 400,000 heat pumps in existing homes. And we know that, similar to what Clare put up, 50% of the homes in Ireland have a BR rating of D or lower, so the bottom half of the BR scale, and they require significant upgrades if we're to get where we need to get. And to date, SEAI has supported over 515,000 homes with their home energy upgrade journey. So the National Retrofit Plan was published in late 2021, and we've had progress reports every year since then. So I'm just going to give a bit of background on where we're at in the overall scheme of things in terms of what SEAI is delivering, and then a bit of a focus then on the warmer home scheme for those low-income, more vulnerable households. So our three main delivery schemes that we have to upgrade homes is the individual energy upgrades, or also known as the Better Energy Home Scheme, the one-stop shop service, different to the one-stop shops in the EPBD context, and then our fully funded energy upgrades, also known as the Warmer Home Scheme. So the individual energy upgrades is basically a homeowner can pick from a menu of upgrades, and they can carry individual upgrades to their home. It's part funded, so the grants are based on about 30-35% of the expected cost for a typical home. The homeowner manages them, the upgrade project, and then pays for the works and claims the grant back about 3 to 4 weeks after the paperwork has gone in. The one-stop shop is the new one. It's been launched in 2022, and that's for people who want to go through a whole big package of works. They might want to renovate their home, or they've bought a new home like that's in a poor condition and want to complete a full home energy upgrade package. That might be wall insulation, roof insulation, windows, heating, solar panels, mechanical ventilation, all as one package of work. So they have to achieve a minimum of a BR rating of B2 and a minimum uplift of 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared per year. So that's basically targeting at that bottom half of the BR scale that they want to get a significant uplift to bring up to a B2. So in that one, the homeowner pays for the works net of the eligible grant. So they don't, the grant amount is deducted from what they cost up front. So they don't have to pay for the full amount of works and then claim the grant back retrospectively. And then finally, the Warmer Home Scheme, the fully funded energy upgrade, is for homeowners in receipt of certain welfare payments. So the likes of the fuel allowance, for example. So that's fully funded and managed by SEAI. So we carry out a home survey. A package of works is recommended for that home. That work is allocated to a contractor, and then the works are carried out, and a BR is included at the end. So just in terms of what our full year report in 2024 said, there was almost 70,000 applications processed, which is a 4% increase on 2023. 54,000 home energy upgrades, which is an increase of 13% on 2023 and almost double what was done in 2022. 21,800 upgrades to a B2 are completed, which is an increase of 24% on 2023 figures, and that's a significant increase of by a factor of 2.5 on what was done in 2022. And the capital expenditure across the grant programs has increased by 30%. 417.6 million was spent in 2024, and that you can see a significant increase on the 267 million in 2022. So in terms of the low-income homes and the warmer home scheme, over 7,700 fully funded home energy upgrades were completed, which is an increase of 30% on 2023. It was 4,438 in 2022. The average spend per home based on the first half of this year was 29,270. And that's an increase by a factor of 11 on the 2,600 that would have been spent in 2018. So historically, the warmer home scheme was an insulation program, and the budget would have been the same since then. I mean, it was based on doing upgrades for like an inch deep and a mile wide. So a little bit was done for a lot of people. So it may have just been attic insulation. You might have got cavity wall insulation. But there's been a huge uptake in the depth of the retrofits in line with the Climate Action Plan and the Energy Poverty Action Plan. So there's a significant outlay on those homes. The capital spend in 2024 was 229 million, which is more double what was spent in 2022. But there are some challenges that we're experiencing on the ground. We have significant ambitious heat pump targets, and the decarbonisation of heat is central to meeting our emissions reduction targets, but the uptake just isn't where it needs to be. We still come across a lot of the misconceptions that have been doing the rounds for years. They don't work when it gets cold. You can only put them in A-rated houses, or they only work in new houses. Radiators don't work. Just that they're expensive. Electric heaters it's not as bad here in the UK with papers like the Telegraph regularly publish articles that are essentially just misinformation. But just the awareness of it, and people kind of have this concern that's so different and so new that they're not as willing to make that leap. The spike in electricity prices, as was mentioned already, has been a big issue because once upon a time, not that long ago, back maybe middle of 2021, electricity prices were maybe 16 cents a unit for day rate. Now they went up to 42 cents in probably late 2022. It's come back down a little bit now, but the price of electricity is about 3 times the price of gas. And if the efficiency is about 3 times the price, if the efficiency of a heat pump is 3 times the price of gas, then or 3 times the efficiency of a gas boiler, it sort of balances out. So the financial argument isn't there at the minute, and we do need to look at that because we've seen in countries where that gap in the ratio, or the ratio between gas and electricity, is more favorable for electricity. There's been a higher deployment of heat pumps, and there's been a bigger uptake of heat pumps. And people have this very real fear of increased costs, especially people in fuel poor homes. We've seen that, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But there's a concern that putting in a heat pump just means higher electricity bills, and that you're going to end up having to pay more to stay warm in your house. And it has an impact on our warmer home scheme as well. The other aspect to it is that the building regulations. So if you are undergoing a major renovation on a home, since it was brought in, Part L was brought in 2019. If you are upgrading, say, 25% of the thermal envelope of a house, so typically external or internal wall insulation would trigger a major renovation. So that means you need to look at improving your roof insulation if it's below a certain level, and also to upgrade the heating system if it's more than 15 years old and it's less than 86% efficient. And as of January this year, member states cannot provide financial incentives for fossil fuel boilers. So what that means is that in a warmer home scheme project, if work triggers a major renovation, then if a heating upgrade is needed, then SEAI can only install a heat pump. Now, there's a lot of instances in houses where it's very, very difficult to get the heat loss from a house down to a level that means it's suitable for a heat pump. And the reality is that we've seen is a lot of people just don't want heat pumps. Like I said, it maybe comes down to that fear of increased costs, if there's a lot of, again, like I said, a lot of stuff gets peddled online. I mean, we put out a lot of information on our website, but I don't know if people go to the SEAI website necessarily before they go to social media to get information on heat pumps and how they work. So there has been that fear, and we have been met by a lot of people that said, I don't want to put in a heat pump. And if we're not in a position to put in a heat pump, then the work we can do is limited, because then we can't be compliant with the building regulations if we're not upgrading a heating system, if we can't upgrade to a heat pump. So it limits what we can actually do for that house, especially where if you're not in a position to cavity insulation, and which wouldn't trigger a major renovation, or roof insulation. The next step then, in terms of fossil fuel phase out, that is really welcome. And I think we might necessarily be in a position to have to wait until 2040. I mean, we are the authors of our own destiny here in that regard, but there is a need for a regulatory roadmap and what that means for retrofit. And while we do need to decarbonize our heating to meet our emissions target, it also needs to really be fair, because we do see, as Clare said, like a lot of the people in that poor housing are dependent on solid fuel heating, for example, or oil heating, and it's very difficult to swap from someone who possibly, we've seen some cases where they've been provided a shed full of turf for a year from a family member, and that means they have zero or very little heating costs, and then putting in a heat pump can increase their costs, and it just needs to be done fairly. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of, as Clare again said, with a lot of social housing and approved housing bodies, that it's really important as that buy-in from the people living in these homes. And we've seen instances from some research that we funded where, if homeowners or the people living in the house haven't bought into this retrofit journey, their experience can be negative, because they haven't been engaged. And it's really important that these people their homes that are being retrofitted, that they feel like the retrofit is something that's being done for them, rather than something that's being done to them, because that buy-in is important and ultimately in how that home performs. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Brian, for providing that perspective on the implementation of retrofit on the ground. We've a few minutes now for a very quick Q&A, and thank you so much to our speakers for giving us their time today, and for everyone joining the session. We have a couple of questions here, so one or two to Ciarán. I'm going to put these to you, Ciarán, but anyone else is really welcome to jump in and answer these as well. Will the directive stop the reuse of derelict and vacant buildings, as they require high standards that are, I think that's high standards of renovation that are unaffordable for the owners of these small scale buildings in our villages, towns and cities? And then another one, is there anything in the directive about prioritising the refurbishment of buildings over demolition due to the carbon emissions associated with that demolition? So Ciarán, if that's all right, if I go to you first, and then if anybody else would like to jump in on that, please do. Ciarán may not be available at the moment, if anyone else would like to jump in.
The second one, if I can, perhaps.
Yeah, please do.
I think there's a few things there. So, yeah, in the previous version, Ciarán could say more about that, but in other previous draft version of the directive, there was stronger focus on the concept of sufficiency and circularity. Unfortunately, it's not as strong in the final version. It's still mentioned as part of the National Renovation Plan, but it's kind of weak in the way it framed in terms of how it might be covered. Saying that, I think starting to measure wildlife carbon would be a first step in terms of, because obviously if you start measuring and you need to reduce wildlife carbon emission, even if the focus is on new build, it should make demolition less attractive over time. The other thing I would like to mention there is that all these support instruments in the text of the directive, being in terms of financial support or technical support, so really there may be an opportunity in terms of financial support, like to ensure that it doesn't lead to further dereliction, and that these buildings are prioritized. And in terms of technical support, one thing that is probably worth exploring, given all the challenges of bringing these buildings, some of these vacant buildings back into use, would be to have one-stop shop of information hubs that really, in the interest of the building owner, could look at both energy efficiency and bringing back this building into use. Like, it seems a bit of a missed opportunity if this is not at least tested as an idea or piloted. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marion. Ciarán, did you want to come in on that as well? Sorry, your audio is gone there, I'm afraid. Okay, don't worry. We'll come back to you in a second. I don't know why that's gone, but don't worry. Cristina, there is a question here for you, if that's okay. Someone has asked about gas cooking and say that they personally know elder adults who use gas due to the fear of power cuts. How can we support those who are vulnerable with power cuts happening regularly in certain areas? And then Brian, there's a question here for yourself as well. What independent checks are run on the SEAI grants and OSS renovated buildings to make sure they're delivered as promised? So that's kind of addressing that question of quality assurance. And so Cristina, will go to you first.
No, thank you. And thank you for the question. I think it really highlights what was mentioned at the beginning already, that buildings are a part of the decarbonization puzzle, and there is definitely more to be done in terms of the energy grid and so on. But what is important at this point is to raise awareness among policymakers and among people and residents that this is an issue, and so to gather more support to find solutions, like acknowledge the fact that there is a problem to begin with and that there is a solution and there is available technology that is cleaner and is affordable and can be incorporated in this transition to benefit all, and then find all the other solutions that come with it.
Super. Thanks very much, Cristina.
I'll just come in on the grants. We do have an inspections regime that inspects houses that are completed both on all the grant schemes and on the one-stop shop. I'm not entirely sure if that's ventilation was omitted, whether it was a mechanical ventilation system that wasn't performing, or if it was there wasn't adequate background ventilation provided. But in both cases, I mean, the mechanical ventilation system would have to be independently validated. And like our inspection regime would pick up on things like where there's not sufficient ventilation provided to be in line with Part F of the building regulations, and those things would come across, come out, and if we're seeing that crop up, it'll be more targeted inspections on that one-stop shop and those contractors. So we do address that. I can answer the question, I think, on the recent derelict and vacant buildings as well to some degree. It sort of touches on, there's a bit of an overlap with traditional buildings that would never be able to reach the levels expected of the zero emissions buildings, because it would be inappropriate to do so given the way technically that they would need to be insulated with more breathable materials and so on. It just has to be done more carefully. So there is an acceptance that about 40, a lot of these buildings, I think 40% of these traditional buildings may not ever be able to achieve like the zero emissions buildings. So it's more focused on optimizing what can be done, and then they get reported every year to the Commission. So it's not answering the full gamut of the derelict and vacant buildings, but a lot of those buildings would be older, considered traditional construction.
Absolutely. And there's a follow-up question, Brian, that I might put to you just very quickly, and then we'll come back to Ciarán and then Clare if you'd like to come in on anything as well. So Brian, just regarding the quality of retrofit works carried out in the National Retrofit Plan, are local authorities responsible for oversight of quality of the works? And where will responsibility lie when the new directive comes into effect, or the recast directive comes into effect?
The local authorities would be responsible for the quality of works done through the energy efficiency or the retrofit program that the local authorities have. So with the likes of the one-stop shop, the quality would still be a very big push, and that is quality assurance side of things for the one-stop shop, and that's part of the rigor that goes through the registration process, and we'll hopefully see more and more of that. Again, like we do inspect them, but it's the responsibility of all the contractors that are partaking in the grant schemes, and that's why we do have inspections, and now we do have a quality assurance and disciplinary program where penalty points are picked up for regular fails on the inspection regime. And like the inspection regime is dynamic insofar as that it's looking at the kind of things that are cropping up in inspections. So inspections become more targeted. Then if we're seeing people who come with the same fails, then we'll address that in a more remedial manner. But I'm not sure what the National Building Renovation Plan will change in that regard, but that's how that's where it is at the moment.
Great, thanks, Brian. Ciarán, we'll come back to you again.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me now?
You can, thank you.
Yeah, great. Just on the issue that the EPBD might dissuade people from renovating, I don't think it will, because we look at the residential and the non-residential sector in two different ways. In the residential sector, the obligation to renovate doesn't fall directly on the occupier or the owner. It falls on the state to ensure that a energy saving of 16% is realized in the residential building stock by 2030. So the state should be bending over backwards to make anyone renovate a building in the first instance. When it comes to commercial or non-residential buildings, we are saying that the worst buildings need to be renovated, but we're not expecting an A energy rating overnight. We want to get to a zero emission building by 2050, but the targets for the coming years are relatively low. So it involves getting from an E to a D in the Irish context, for example. So we don't want people to run before they can walk. So I don't think it will dissuade people from doing a renovation of an older building. And as the previous speaker just said, if it's a heritage building, if it's a protected structure, the EPBD does not apply in terms of the ratings that you have to achieve. So listed buildings or protected structures will not have obligatory renovations.
Okay, that's great. Really clear. Thanks so much, Ciarán. Clare, hand over to you for the last word if there's anything you want to add.
No pressure. No, I think it was really great to hear, I think, from all the speakers, and Brian in particular, on the actual on-the-ground reality of the implementation of the EPBD and the retrofit schemes. Like, it's really invaluable, I think, to be able to hear that. So yeah, thanks for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Clare. Thanks so much to everyone for your time today, to our expert speakers for providing such comprehensive and brilliant presentations. And I think it's been really driven home that the Recast Directive is a real opportunity to deliver on climate and housing justice. We can deliver lower energy bills, especially for vulnerable populations, and provide warm and comfortable homes. But to achieve this, we really need to see a socially inclusive implementation, and we do need to see a consultation run as soon as possible to make sure that everybody is actually a part of this conversation, and that we don't make our existing housing crisis any worse than it already is. But there is a real opportunity here to deliver on both climate and housing justice. So thanks so much to everybody for joining us today. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available online afterwards. And I hope that you'll take a read through some of the resources shared in the chat as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.